While deferring to male knowledge and power, they subtly revise and undermine the world from which they are excluded. And welcome to Alice's Shelf. Today we'll be talking about A Literature of Their Own by Elaine Schowalter, which is my main foundation on feminist criticism. And we'll be a little theoretical today. So to those who are interested in that, I think it will be very, very fun. So let's go for it. One of the bases of Schowalter's studies is the connection between dominant and muted cultures, which means that the world is laid upon ideas that represent certain groups, for example, men, male experiences. And while that happens, other experiences are muted. In the case of this study, women's experiences. And then she poses the question of, do women share a common heritage connected to their womanhood? What makes all women similar? She will also pose the question, can a minority criticism develop its own methods and theories through wide and careful readings of its own literary texts? So the idea is to create a theory of literary analysis that comes from literature produced by women. We will start looking at literature from a whole new perspective, from the woman world, from the woman point of view. And this is the basis of what she calls gynocriticism, basing the analysis of female texts on female writings. She also proposes that the female writing goes through three phases. Firstly, we have the feminine writing, which is connected to oppression, to subordination, to the male stigma. Next, we have the feminist approach, which is connected to protest. And finally, we have a female approach, which is connected to autonomy. And those phases interlap. And she also says that Virginia Woolf tried to create an androgynous literature, but she failed. We'll get there. One of the first statements she makes is that women's writings should not have to succumb to any apologies, but they can be judged as aesthetically as any other piece of literature. They do not have to be excluded just because they were written by women. They have to be analyzed from the right perspective, not from the dominant one. However, for years, female literature was undermined by the main culture of literary analysis. And that's because women would focus on themes that were not interesting to men. So they would belittle those works and only focus on what was good for them. And well, where does this idea of women focused on topics that did not concern men come from? From the fact that women's lives were completely different. They were locked inside their homes, they couldn't get to work, they didn't have the life experience a man could have. So their writings would usually look to the inner side of self, to their own room, to their own house, because that was the life they had. So they would either talk about what they were allowed to live, or they would try to assume and imagine and create what the world of men could give them if they were allowed in. One of the main problems we have when trying to create a history for the female literature is that we have mountains and valleys. What does Schowalter means with that? Many of the writings done by women were erased by society, and many of them never came to light because women were not allowed to write. So we have this big valley, and within this valley we have some mountains like Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters, but they are the exception. We are trying to find within this valley that's covered by fog what was erased. And for us to build a genealogy to all of that, it's really, really hard because we just don't have the materials. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking a little about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And she'll talk about how if Shakespeare had a sister, we would never have heard of her because she couldn't have been a writer, no matter how talented she was, because her time didn't allow her to. So there's this huge blank space that is really hard for us to fill, and that may be an obstacle when we try to analyze female literature from its own point of view. And that also meant that women writers would always start from zero, meaning they didn't have access to what other women had written. They only had access to what men had written. So they couldn't go back to their own history, to their own thoughts, to what they had created. They always had to start from scratch until they could finally break through into this industry. And it's important to remember that many women writers, when they first started getting published, would use male names because it was just not a world for women. And also, trying to fit into this world, many female writers back in the 18th century would succumb to the idea of fragile femininity. So we'd have weak women in their novels so that their characters would fit the male stigma and they could sell their novels, they could sell their books, especially because men were usually the buyers. These writers, the Victorian feminine writers, they wanted to be on the same level as men. They didn't want to be analyzed and judged as women writers. They wanted to write just like men. And that echoed in their works because they tried to make it so that their novels fit the way novels were being written by centuries. They wanted to fit the male point of view. However, Schowalter emphasizes that the idea of female dominance, that women were different and they were gonna take over, was an idea that had always come from the eyes of men. Men were afraid that women would take over, and that happens throughout history all the time. The idea of a gay dictatorship that happened in Brazil a while ago, it's like, hey, it's not happening. But dominant cultures are afraid that undermined cultures will reach a level of equity and want to take over power. There's always the idea of a power dynamics. And Schowalter emphasizes that the idea that women wanted to take over the literary market came from men. Women never wanted to do that. They only wanted to have the opportunity to break into the market that was restricted to them. And the way they found to do that at first was to sign their novels as if they were men. However, the difference in sex culminated in a bunch of other differences in life experiences that went from education to means of support to age of first publication. Not until the period between 1900 and 1935 did a group of women who had studied at universities became writers. And that was a small percentage. Only 38 of the women writers were actually educated in universities. And that's actually one of the common aspects of feminine literature, their envy of classical education. Because they could not go to universities. That was a place that belonged to the men. I've mentioned time and again the male personas they used to write, and the thing is that those personas were everything in those women that extrapolated what was expected of their femininity. It was their way of being more than what people wanted them to be. Those first women writers, the feminine novelists, also believed that it was very important for them to find a balance between their labor and their home lives. So they wouldn't let go of their jobs as wives that they had had for centuries, but they wanted to find a balance between that and their job. And the critics from that era focused a lot on biology. There was an idea that childbirth was a rival to creativity. So the fact that women gave birth to children was something that made them less creative. There was also the idea that the female brain was weaker than the male brain, so much so that they would see the female brain as either a self-destructive imitation or a male brain still in development. Besides the biological explanation, there was, and there still is, an idea of a social explanation. Why women focus on the inner feelings? Because that's their experience. So for many feminine novelists, we had the main character as almost a biographical character. They represent the thoughts and the beliefs of the writers themselves. And in doing so, I go back to my first quote of this video. They would undermine what was so praised by men, and they were able to even make housey women from the Victorian era look like heroines. So they changed the way women were seen. And that's a first very important shift in literature. Even trying to fit the male stigmas, these feminine novelists changed the way women were seen in literature. And who were the men in those texts? That's very interesting. Schowalter says, and I quote, "Men," these novels are saying, "must learn how it feels to be helpless and to be forced unwillingly into dependency. Only then can they understand that women need love, but hate to be weak. If he is to be redeemed and to rediscover his humanity, the women's man must find out how it feels to be a woman." So the man created by those women lacked humanity. They changed the whole idea because men have the labor world and they go out and they have a social life and they lack of humanity. And in order for them to exist and to survive those stories that were being written by women, they had to find their humanity again. They had to learn how it feels like to be a woman. How interesting is that? And that also leads us to the idea of novels with a secret, which means that there was this communal unconscious feeling between the women because of their female suppressed emotions. And something that would happen very often was the death of the husband. And the death of the husband was usually seen as a relief. We can see that in, for example, Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour. The death of the husband meant freedom to those women. And that's something that was common amongst them. So we start to build a community, something that had been lacking as aforementioned. Somewhere women could read about what other women had written before them. And then we go into the feminist writers and the sensationalist novels, in which women could deposit their hostility towards men into violent action. We start to fight, and that's where the feminist literature exists. These feminist novelists didn't discard the ideas of the feminine novelists of what it means to be a woman, the ideas of womanhood. However, they turned those ideas into action and into a fight. And from that moment on, we had an idea of kinship. a connection between women. They were fighting against the male system. However, those revolutionary ideas were thrown into male characters, and they were the ones who would take action in the novels. However, those male characters were quite androgynous, and they would most frequently look in. We were still talking about the inner person, not the social one, the emotional one. So although they projected all of that into a male persona, they were talking about what it meant to be a woman and what it meant to fight as a woman. Schowalter also emphasizes that there was the creation of almost a mystical connection between women that came from a shared pain. Women shared a common pain that derived from being inserted into a male system, and that would frequently lead them into suicide. And suicide also became a sign of freedom, of letting go of the male world in which they were suppressed. Then we reach the female novelists who finally started to question the ideas on womanhood. They started to realize that what was understood as being a woman came from men, and they didn't have to succumb to that. And they also shifted the idea of suicide as a sign of relief to a weapon. Suicide became a weapon against the world in which they lived. They killed themselves because to kill another, that's a male thing. That's a male experience. They looked in, they killed themselves. And somehow these women started to project their femaleness onto the language itself, the way the stories were told. They weren't supposed to match what the market wanted. They were supposed to come from their own realities and their point of view into this world. There was finally a refusal to succumb to the male culture and a journey to nowhere, a journey to the female culture, which never existed. So they started carving a path that they didn't know where they were going, but they had to go somewhere that was not where they were. Now, going back to what Elaine Schowalter had mentioned about Virginia Woolf and androgynous literature. When I started my master's in literature, my project was focused exactly on that. Because Elaine Schowalter says that Virginia Woolf tried to start an androgynous literature by finding a place between maleness and femaleness, and she failed. My theory was that she had failed because she tried to create a place that existed situated between maleness and femaleness, whereas androgyny might be actually the ability to move freely between maleness and femaleness. It's not being stuck in the middle ground, but being able to go from a male to a female. And I based my theory on Virginia Woolf's Orlando, an autobiography, and Angela Carter's Orlando, or the Enigma of the Sexes. Because I defend that Angela Carter understood that, and Angela Carter started carving the path to an androgynous literature. So that's what we have for Elaine Schowalter's A Literature of Their Own. I know it's tough. If you have any doubts, drop them here in the comments. It's a huge book, so this is just a summary of her main ideas. But I hope you liked it, and I hope to see you next week so we can keep on talking about Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. We'll talk about the second tale, The Courtship of Mr. Leon. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with everyone. Literally, everyone. Okay, please? And remember, life's a sin.